Hello and welcome back to True Crime and Tea, or welcome to True Crime and Tea if this is your first time. It's great to see you today. And today we are diving into another true crime case that's quite recent. Actually, this only happened in 2019. It's the Vallow-Daybell case. So Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell, but we're more going to be focusing on Lori Vallow's story. And it's the Doomsday's homicides that bring together a tragic collision of religious extremism and psychological deterioration. We have spoken before about the religious radicalization and fanaticism when we spoke about the Andrea Yates case, who was a mother who unalived her 5 children because she believed that she was saving them from eternal damnation. If you want to watch that video, that will be linked in the description, but this is the video that I talk about that. And there were many factors that went into that case, and today's case is not much different in the sense that the religious radicalization does happen. Now, disclaimer, this story is going to involve stories on homicides of children. We are going to be making references to religious radicalization. So if it's something that you don't think you can sit through, we understand. But just a disclaimer about today's story. Lori Vallow was born Lori Noreen Cox in 1973, and she was raised in California to a Mormon family. I couldn't find much on her childhood, but I did see that her parents were tax protesters, which meant that they adhered to sovereign citizenship. And it's an ideology where they have problems generally with the IRS. It's just a blanket statement of tax evasion, but they don't believe that they need to adhere to a state or a government kind of regime. That's what I read. Allegedly, that's what they believed. And that's all I'll say about her childhood. In 1992, at the age of 19, Lori marries her high school boyfriend. Now, Lori marries 5 times, so this is the first of many. So she marries her boyfriend, however, they quickly divorce. She then married again in 1995, and she had a son with her husband called Colby. Colby was born in 1996. Then she divorced husband number 2 in 1998. So they was only married for 3 years. In 2001, she married again, and this time she got married to a man named Anthony Ryan Jr. They had a daughter together called Tylee in 2002. Now, this was not a successful marriage, and they divorced in 2005. Their divorce was quite a bitter divorce, with Lori accusing Ryan of essaying the children, which meant that he would lose custody of the children. Essentially, it would be lose custody of Tylee because Colby wasn't actually his child, but he lost custody, lost the ability to be able to see the children. Around the same time this was happening in 2007, Lori's brother, Alex Cox, then attacked Joseph, claiming that he was abusive to Lori and the children. In 2018, Joseph Ryan was found deceased in his home, and it was claimed to be from cardiovascular disease. However, after Lori gets arrested in 2020, it was also noted that she had mentioned wanting to unalive Joseph. So the police reviewed his death, they did a bit of an investigation, and the same year, Colby, the older son, also accused Joseph of abusing him as a child. His name is Anthony Joseph. I'm teetering between the two names, okay? His name is Anthony Ryan Joseph. Even after this accusation that was made by Colby, it was found that his death had nothing to do with foul play. Unfortunately, though, they weren't able to confirm or deny whether the accusations that were made against him were factual, which I think is awful for his family. But I also feel like Colby said it, so potentially did that happen, or did his mum kind of coerce him into saying it? Who knows? Either way, they weren't able to corroborate this information, but they know factually he died from cardiovascular disease. Lori had nothing to do with his death. Over the years, like I said, Lori got married 5 times, and her 4th husband was a gentleman named Leland Charles Anthony Vallow, who we will refer to as Charles. She married him in February of 2006. Charles' sister had a son. She was not able to look after her son, and so initially the custody of her son, who was called Joshua JJ Vallow, we will refer to him as JJ, lots of names in this case. Initially, he was being taken care of by his grandparents. However, they were not able to look after him, or for some reason, JJ ended up in the care of Charles and Lori. And then in 2014, Lori and Charles officially adopted JJ. JJ also had autism. After this adoption happened, things that were okay seemed to change a bit. And this started happening around 2015 when Lori became interested in a book series called Standing in Holy Places by Chad Daybell. She read and reread this book series over the years, and this was the introduction into what would become radical religious beliefs for Lori. Because not only did she become interested in reading these really radical religious books, they covered things like doomsday and stuff like that, and they covered things like near-death experiences, and she would read books like that, and then she would also be listening to podcasts like this as well. In 2018, Lori met Chad Daybell. So she met the author of this book series. He's written many other books. He wrote the Holy Places series, and he also wrote apocalyptic fiction books, and he was a fringed religious figure, so he was known in certain religious circles. He had written a memoir, and it's called Living on the Edge, and he claimed to have 2 near-death experiences, and that those near-death experiences had led to him having supernatural visions, and he claimed that these visions came from beyond the veil. He often wrote about receiving guidance from supernatural voices, insisting that the books that we say are fictional, so religious fiction books, they are more books that depict real events over being fiction. This is what he claims. He also contributed regularly to a Mormon forum called Another Voice of Warning, the AVAL forum. And this is where he shared his experiences and his future predictions, because he also could apparently see the future. He believed that he could communicate with the spirit world, and that his words, he said the world was going to end in 2020, and he eventually started claiming that Lori was he was the chosen one to lead the 144,000 into New Jerusalem. And because of this, Lori became obsessed. She started referring to people as light and dark, claiming that the people who were possessed by spirits were the dark ones. Now, remember Charles? Yes, Charles was one of those people who, in her eyes, had become a demon. And she told her friends that she was a goddess that was sent to usher in the new or the second coming. So she was a goddess. Yeah, okay. In 2019, can you even be shocked? Charles and Lori are having marital problems. Pretty much because of her beliefs. Now, initially, this was not a known fact. The marital problems only came out as part of the investigation after the incident that we're going to be talking about. And because of the marital problems they were having, it was actually Lori who had accused Charles of infidelity. And because of these accusations, Charles and Lori decided to separate, and Charles moved Lori, Tylee, and JJ into the Four Peaks Place apartments while he stayed in Texas. And he would obviously come down to visit because his children are with her. Because of the uncertainty of their relationship, Lori at some point decided to leave JJ with Charles at one point for about 2 months. And at this point, Charles became worried about Lori's mental state. And this was because she would constantly talk about being selected to prepare the 144,000 people for the end of the world. He would file a mental health petition that was basically a request to get Lori evaluated. And in his petition, he would talk about how Lori had said that he was possessed by a demon, and his demon was called Ned Schneider. And when Lori spoke to Charles, she no longer called him by his government name, Charles. She would refer to him as Ned Schneider. On July the 11th, 2019, Alex Cox, Lori's brother, would call Chandler police and state that he had shot his brother-in-law in self-defense. However, after interviews with Lori, the children, and Alex, they started realizing that the facts weren't, the math wasn't mathing. It wasn't making sense, their story and their timelines. And eventually it would come out what had actually happened. Now, at the same time as this going on, the grandmother of JJ would start getting a bit concerned because she was unable to get in contact with JJ, and other families were trying to get in contact with Tylee and JJ, and they were just not able to like FaceTime or speak to them on the phone. At one point, family members had then asked the police to do like a welfare check on the children, and when the police went to Lori's home, she stated that the children were staying at a friend's house. When the police went to do the welfare check, by this point Lori and Alex had moved to Rexburg, Idaho. When the police had gone to do the welfare check on the children and Lori had said no, they've gone to live with friends, the police went to the friend's place to do again the welfare check, only to find out that Lori had lied. The children had never stayed with this friend. And this so-called friend that lived in Arizona turned round to the police and was like, I've never been a guardian for the children. That was a lie. Essentially, Lori was giving the police the runaround, kind of not being forthcoming with where the children are and if they're well and if anything has happened to them. So, Chad Daybell had a wife called Tammy. Remember, Chad is the author, and he's the one that said that Lori is a prophetess and a goddess that's going to lead the 144,000 through the end of the world in 2020. Right. Chad had a wife called Tammy. Tammy was a devout, loving wife of Chad. She mysteriously died on the 19th of October in 2019 in her sleep. Within the month of her death, Chad and Lori get married. After finding out this little nugget, the Chandler Police, the Gilbert Police Department, Fremont County Sheriff's Department, and the FBI all start paying more attention to Chad and Lori and start coordinating their efforts to try and find out where and what has happened to Tylee and JJ. Whilst carrying out these because there's a few investigations going on at the same time. Charles's death's investigation, at some point the investigation into how Tammy died and the disappearance of the two children. They were also investigating the other husband, Ryan's Ryan Anthony's death around this same time. At the time of doing these investigations, they come to find out that Lori, Chad, and Alex had been conspiring to get rid of Charles. One, because he was going to confront Lori about her religious radicalization, and two, because Lori and Chad needed to marry so that their prophecy could be fulfilled. This is what the police had found out. This is what the investigations had uncovered. They both needed Charles out of the picture because he was talking too much about religious radicalization, and Chad and Lori needed to get married. It also came out in the investigation that they believed Tylee and JJ had been possessed, but they weren't referred to as demons. They were referred to as zombies. In 2019, January 2019, Lori tells her friend that she's had visions that she can create storms and fire and will have the eye of the Lord. And then in February 2019, Lori tells her friend that Charles is blocking her gifts, and I just made the assumption that this was her saying that he was blocking her ability with these phantom powers that she said she had. Following these conversations about harming Charles, who had also been referred to as Ned and Hiplos, that was a name that just was randomly thrown in there. Now, side point, before Charles's death, she had done some research for disability insurance. And the search was important because it showed that there was a monetary gain or a monetary reason for Charles needed to be out of the picture. Now, after this happens, she messages Chad a week after the homicide, and she says that she's talked to the insurance. She said, I talked to the insurance company. He changed it in March. He being Charles. So it was probably Ned, the demon, before we got rid of him. They can't tell me who, of course, it's done. I'll get some of the 3,000 a month from SS. SS, I assumed, was Social Security. But you can see that she clearly thought that she was going to gain something from getting rid of Charles, other than the fact that her and Chad needed to be married. And it wasn't just about... So it kind of got rid of the whole accident. It was self-defense theory that was coming from Alex Cox, her brother. Now, remember that Lori accused Charles of infidelity. Well, there was a message between Alex and Lori. Alex is Lori's brother, where there's this discussion that Charles was suspicious about Lori's relationship with Chad. And because of this, there was evidence that he had confronted her about it, and he was going to talk to Tammy, Charles's wife, about his suspicions. Charles had gone to Alex, Lori's brother, and had tried to arrange some sort of an intervention so that he could talk to Lori about her radical beliefs that she currently had. And this was due to take place on or around the 10th of July 2019, because he had arranged for Charles, him and his brother to go to Arizona. Through this whole period of communication back and forth between Lori and Alex, there was no clear communication between Lori and Chad about Charles. So there wasn't really any evidence that could link Chad to Charles's homicide. These names, there's a lot. However, we do know that Lori found out about the intervention through her mother, because Alex had told his mother that Charles had planned on doing this intervention, and then the mother had told Lori, and then the timeline just kind of falls into place. Now, we know that Charles got to the apartment because obviously he's in the apartment when the police find him, but Alex and Lori wasted a lot of time before they actually called emergency services, with Lori going to Burger King randomly to get food for JJ. And then after she went to Burger King, she went to Walgreens to waste more time to get flip-flops for Tylee. Just random things, like just off the cuff, she decided to make trips out. And then she returned home. But when Alex called 911, he had made it seem like he was giving CPR to Charles. However, when the emergency services arrived, they noticed that there was blood coming from Charles, which would have meant that Alex hadn't tried to save him. And based on the timeline, from what they observed, that would have meant that Charles would have been laying there dying for 43 minutes before Alex called 911. And actually, the first person he did call before he called 911 was Lori. And the assumption is that he called Lori to come back so she could be there, and then he called, or on her way when like the emergency services turn up, because then that's evidence that she wasn't in the home when it happened. But basically, it threw the whole argument that they had made about their timeline out of the window. Their timeline was flawed and extremely suspicious. Now, tracking back to the fact that the investigators are also looking for Tylee and JJ, there is evidence that Tylee and JJ were with Lori at the time of their father's homicide. One, because Tylee actually provided statements to the police about what she had seen, but we know that Tylee and JJ are no longer with us. So what happened? Right. Remember the family members that were concerned they couldn't get in contact with the children? One of the family members was actually Tylee and JJ's older brother, Kobe. Kobe had been messaging Tylee, but she had responded that she couldn't talk on the phone, wasn't able to talk on the phone, which concerned him because that wasn't normal for them. So obviously he was one of the people that had raised the alarm about the whereabouts of the children. And it became even more concerning when the police discovered that Lori and Chad and Alex were just lying about the children's location. From their investigations, it was noted that Tylee was definitely seen at least on the 8th of September 2019. And she was seen at Yellowstone National Park. JJ was last seen on September the 22nd, 2019 at his mother's home in Rexburg, Idaho. Sadly, both of the children's bodies were found deceased, and they were actually found on Chad Daybell's property. So what they think happened was, the day after, they think that Tylee passed away on September the 9th, 2019 in Rexburg. And that's based on the location data that they traced from Alex Cox's phone, her uncle. The day after September the 22nd, Lori told friends that JJ was staying at their uncle's house, at Uncle Alex Cox. And authorities believe that JJ died around that time based on, again, the location data of Alex's phone. Because on September the 23rd, they had an unexcused absence for JJ from school. So there was the assumption that he didn't go to school. He must have passed the day before or on that day. However, even after the disappearances and homicides of the children, Lori continued to collect social security survivor benefits. So this whole concept that she was the prophetess or the goddess or whatever, and she was clairvoyant, it all kind of gets muddied because of the fact that she clearly was financially benefiting from the homicides that had been committed. One person testified that Chad had told his followers that JJ was going to come back as Colby's son, which I think was sick. And then the FBI uncovered messages between Lori and Chad, who had Tylee and JJ's possession, because remember they were zombies. They had spoke about their possession and mentioned that they had a perfectly orchestrated plan to take care of the children. And then a text conversation between Lori and Alex mentioned working on the Z's, which we assume to be zombies, where Lori said that she'd observed JJ and that she sensed he was barely attached to his body. The whole text message communication thing was just weird and wild. One, they must have known at some point these messages were going to be traceable, right? But it's just the lack of common sense, maybe. I don't know the wording to you, but they're just everything in a text message to each other about the children being zombie. It just, because they also discussed getting rid of Tammy's demon, who was called Viola, and Chad messaged Lori on the night that Viola passed and said that it was not fully sure of the timing for removal, but once her actions verified the differences, I won't want to wait. Essentially, once I see that Viola's not really active anymore, I'm going to attempt to get rid of that demon. Then on the 19th of October, Tammy goes to bed and with a cough, essentially. She goes to bed with a cough and she just doesn't wake up the next day. And as I read through these communications, it was just very obvious there was a disconnect to reality, and what they were doing in their warped world, whatever belief system that they were under, they felt that it made sense. But it also made me think, were they just writing this as kind of like an alibi so they could say, no, I am not with it because you can see I believed that these people were possessed. So there was like an ulterior motive to that, because we know quite clearly it was a financial reason why they needed to get rid of Charles and the two children. And obviously they needed to get rid of Tammy because Chad and Lori needed to get married. Because literally within 2 weeks, within the month of Tammy's death, Lori and Chad got married in Hawaii on the 1st of November 2019, which doesn't really make sense. And then Chad gave Alex something called a patriarchal blessing, which, being members of the LDS church, he didn't have any, yes, because there was members of the LDS church as well, that he didn't have any standing to be able to do that. He was not ordained or enough to be able to give that blessing to Alex. So essentially, what exactly was he doing? Like everything they do up until this point and thereafter makes no sense at all. Anyway, Alex Cox died on the 12th of December 2019. Now, within this period of time, Alex does meet someone and she becomes his partner. Alex died quite quickly after they discover the children, and his death is attributed to a blood clot and to blood clots, it was plural, and high blood pressure. But the day before his death, he had been informed that by Lori and Chad that Tammy Daybell's body was going to be exhumed. And his partner, his woman, Zulema Pasternas, testified that he had told her he was worried that Lori and Chad were going to make him the fall guy. So essentially, he would be the scapegoat for all of everything that had happened. Now, before we find out what happened to Lori, because we will find out what happened to her in the end, I want to look at this through an academic lens. And when I first looked at this case, I thought of Lifton's theory of thought reform, because we've looked at it before and we looked at it in relation to cult members of the Sarah Lawrence, because actually Lori and Chad were in somewhat of a cult, right? There was a group of people that believed in their prophecy, in their doomsday theory. So were essentially, I don't know if we can call them cult leaders, but they were fringing on that, okay? And we looked at it in the Sarah Lawrence case and at how isolation leads to manipulation. And things like love bombing and gaslighting can create the perfect method of transforming the way that a group of people can come to believe the same thing, even if the beliefs are not logical. So essentially, the group believe that Charles is Ned. The group believe in this light and dark people. They believe in zombies. They believe in the apocalypse happening in 2020. So all of their thought processes are the same, even though logically it doesn't really make sense. However, in this case, I don't think that Lori was isolated enough. I don't think she was isolated. I don't think she was isolated enough to be manipulated, if that makes sense. What I think it was is that she read some books, she met a man she liked, hence him becoming hubby number 5, and she was greedy and she wanted to get a paycheck. That's what I believe when I was like retrospectively looking at this case. We also have matricide and infanticide in this case because she unalived her husband and her children. Though she may not directly have committed the crimes, she was involved in the planning, the conspiracy to commit. So we do essentially have some form of matricide and infanticide in this case. She found out Charles was going to confront her about her beliefs and he was going to go and speak to Tammy about it. So she kind of enlisted her brother to be the person to take him down. And then the same with the children. The children were zombies and they needed to free them from possession, but she herself didn't essentially commit the crimes. However, she did conspire to commit the crimes. I do believe, though, that her main modus operandi essentially was for monetary gain. She was motivated by money. She knew that once Charles was out of the way, the children were out of the way, she'd get a paycheck. She'd be able to still continue to collect those social security benefits. And then she continued to do that even after the children had passed away. So it's kind of like, well, I get that maybe she had this warped belief of reality, but I also see some logic in what she was doing because there was a means to an end with the husband and the 2 children. However, Banduri's theory of moral disengagement seems to fit this case more appropriately. This theory discusses 8 cognitive mechanisms that an individual can or may use to separate their moral standards from their harmful actions, which allows them to engage in unethical behavior without holding any accountability or self-condemnation. They are able to commit heinous crimes without feeling bad about it, essentially, right? So what happens is a person will restructure the way that they think. They will restructure their harmful behavior to make it appear acceptable, justifiable, and righteous. Because they've changed the mentality, then the internal systems that would usually prevent the behavior are selectively deactivated or bypassed. That is the self-sanction, the feeling of, oh, this is wrong. Those internal systems that would tell them that this is wrong, they can just choose to ignore those, right? And then finally, they avoid negative emotions like guilt, shame, and self-condemnation, which allows them to live with what they've done. That's the emotional detachment. So because they have convinced themselves that they are justified in what they're doing, the behaviors that would tell them it's wrong, they've deactivated those, and then therefore they don't feel guilt for the heinous actions that they have completed. In this case, the moral standard has been adapted through their religious belief system. So now if someone falls into this zombie or dark spirit zone, it's justified for them to get rid of them. It was justified for them to get rid of Charles because he was possessed by Ned. Okay? And therefore, their harmful actions cannot be bad because they've justified their unethical actions. their actions can't be seen as criminal because a demon is bad and the demon is inside Charles and the children. Therefore, they're releasing the children or the husband from being possessed. They need to take them out of limbo and let their spirit free, essentially. So what they're doing in terms of the homicide is justified. So the 8 mechanisms of Bandura's theory are moral justification. So moral justification is the presenting of harmful conduct as serving a moral purpose or greater good. Euphemistic labeling, so using sanitized language to disguise destructive behavior, making it seem benign, not important, is meh. Advantageous comparison, so portraying one's harmful actions as less severe compared to other more reprehensible acts. So essentially, if they had committed the crimes without linking it to demonic possession, that would be a harmful act. But because they've linked it to demonic possession, it's not as bad as someone like Susan Smith, who just got rid of her children because she wanted a man. Okay? Number 4 is displacement of responsibility, believing that the authorities or others are forcing one to act, shifting the blame away from themselves. In this case, we don't really see displacement of responsibility because I guess maybe there is displacement of responsibility because the demons are forcing them to act, but I don't see how those two, it may link, but I didn't link it that. Diffusion of responsibility, so spreading responsibility among a group so no single individual feels personally accountable. You can say this is the case somewhat in this case because Alex, Chad and Lori are all involved in the conspiracy. However, Alex is the only one that actually admits to unaliving Charles by accident, even though we know they were all kind of involved. But there's not really any confirmation of who unalives Tammy. There's not confirmation on who unalives the children. So you kind of have that diffusion of responsibility there, because if no one admits to it, then everybody's guilty. But then if everyone admits to it, then no one is guilty, essentially, right? So the 6th one is distortion of consequences, minimizing, ignoring, or denying the harmful impact of one's actions. They did not think about the impact of getting rid of the zombies. Colby, the brother, was clearly very concerned about his brother and sister, and even Chad saying that JJ was going to come back as Colby's son didn't really do anything to make them feel better. They didn't think about what impact this was going to have thereafter, which then also leads to the 7th point, which is dehumanization, stripping victims of human qualities, making it easier to mistreat them without empathy or remorse. We see dehumanization greatly here because they refer to the husband and the 2 children as demons or zombies or evil spirits. And then the 8th is attribution of blame. So blaming the victim for the suffering that they are experiencing and making their harmful behavior seem justified or deserved. Essentially, Charles deserved what he got because it wasn't really Charles, it was Ned, which is kind of a link between the dehumanization and attributing the blame to the victim. So because those that they unalived were no longer humans, they were possessed by spirits in their bodies, then that meant that the actual people, the spirit themselves, were in limbo. So getting rid of them was justified for 2 reasons. They would be releasing the person out of limbo, and they will be casting the demon of that person back to where it belongs. So Laurie's belief that JJ and Tylee were dark spirits allowed her to dehumanize the children. And this is consistent with Bandura's theory of moral disengagement, where individuals justify their harmful actions by reframing them as righteous and necessary. So yeah, the delusion of being a goddess and preparing people for the 140 of the people or the 144,000 for doomsday was just kind of an added element to this delusion. because it meant that the unaliving of Tammy was also justified, not just because she was Viola, but also because and Charles, not just because they were Viola and Ned, but in order to rescue this 144,000 from Doomsday, Chad and Lori needed to be married. And it also gives space for the measurement of these evil spirits, because they're measuring the pure and the light individuals who will be released and rescued in 2020 when the apocalypse happens, compared to the dark spirited individuals who needed to be dealt with in a more harsher manner. So essentially what they're saying is that Tylee and JJ are better off because now the dark spirits that would have possessed them have gone, so therefore they're light now. They will be able to go through to whatever they believe was next, because no one really thinks about what happens next, do they? It's just, oh yes, Doomsday, but what the 144,000 gonna do that anyway? Yeah. the delusion there is no logic behind the delusion. But this also gives room for Festinger's cognitive dissonance theory and has some application there, because their reality kind of contradicted their beliefs. Lori doubled down, insisting that her children were happy and busy in heaven. So maybe they weren't light spirits that were going to go through the apocalypse. But inevitably, none of that mattered because Lori was a criminal. Initially, Lori was found to not be sane enough to stand trial in 2021. She was declared mentally unfit to stand trial, and she had some psychiatric treatment. And after she had the psychiatric treatment, she was deemed competent in 2022 to stand trial. In 2023, Lori was convicted of the homicides of JJ, Tylee, and Tammy Daybell, and she received life without parole. Chad Daybell was convicted in 2024, and he was actually sentenced to death for these crimes, which I find interesting. Again, we see the woman getting less or harsher treatment than the man. I don't know why that's the case, because she killed 2 children, so I don't know if I believe in the death penalty. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. Sometimes I'm like, well, life for a life. Especially in cases like this, where there's no... Murder is never justified, but children, really? Because you thought they looked like demons? Like, it just doesn't... The math is not mathing. Just electric chair. Anyway, Chad Daybell convicted in 2024, and he was given the death sentence. Lori is now facing additional charges in Arizona for the homicide of Charles Vallow, her husband, and the attempted homicide of her niece's ex-husband. So they had not just stopped at these 4 people. There's another person that Lori is suspected of trying to unalive. Now, throughout the trial, Lori showed not one speck of remorse. She claimed to speak to Jesus. She said that her children visited her in spirit form, and she had done nothing wrong. Yeah. The Lori Vallow-Daybell case is a tragedy. There are so many lives lost and so many more lives impacted by the heinous acts of Lori, Alex, and Chad. But it's also a warning about unchecked belief. Now, I always say this, there is nothing wrong. I myself am a spiritual person. There's nothing wrong with having spiritual beliefs. There is somewhat of a miasma of thought when it comes to unchecked belief and the fragility of the human mind, especially when it's quite susceptible to manipulation and to be brainwashed, essentially. And it also gets us thinking about the systems that failed to protect 2 innocent young children. I do feel when the children initially were missing, why the police didn't go to more places to kind of investigate. Why did they not go to the brother's house? Because they may have been found there. Who knows? But yeah, that's it for today. If you found this video insightful, please like, share, subscribe, follow, turn on that notification bell. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What do you think about the academic insights we looked at today? Let me know what you think. What do you think this case essentially is about? Is it about faith, justice, motherhood? We didn't really cover motherhood too much. We mainly looked at kind of the faith element, but I would like to know your thoughts in terms of what do you yourself think this case is about. And until next time, stay curious, stay critical, always ask questions, stay safe, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.